I knew the moment my son's fiancée smirked at my front door that something inside us would fracture for good. "At least you don't need a Halloween mask," she said, and my son laughed, small, guilty, and on her side. In that breath, years of quiet dignity were treated like currency to be spent, my home reduced to a prop and my face to a punchline. I didn't shout. I did something colder. I started writing things down, names, dates, filings, because when love turns into a scheme, mercy needs a paper trail. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about a father who refused to be harvested, a house that wouldn't be staged, and a woman who had no idea who she was trying to humiliate. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. I was polishing the brass latch on the piazza door when the harbor wind rose and salted the air. Spanish moss wrote gray cursive over the live oaks, and the gas lamps along our narrow street trembled. Inside, the kitchen kept its own weather. She-crab soup ticked on the back burner. Shrimp and grits rested under a folded towel that still held Ruth's citrus soap. I set her blue-edged china, 2 plates slightly chipped on linen instead of paper, and straightened the forks until the table looked like a promise kept. My name is Ernest Cole, 61, widower, retired head of ethics and compliance for a regional health system. I spent years asking hard questions in rooms that preferred compliments. Now I volunteer at the library off Meeting Street, teaching seniors to freeze their credit, read URLs like faces, and close a door without apologizing. I prepare for visitors the way I once prepared for audits, quietly, respectfully, with a stack of truths no one has to see. Mason, my boy at 33, builds bridges and believes understanding can be engineered with math and patience. After Ruth passed, we learned to talk less and assume more. He called to say he would bring his fiancée, Sabrina, for dinner. I ironed a shirt I hardly wear, timed the soup to peak at 7, and touched Ruth's picture frame. "Help me be kind," I said, and closed the kitchen on its steam. When the bell rang, I took one breath, opened as a gentleman should, and met a smile designed for cameras. Sabrina stepped in as if onto a set. Her gaze made a quick inventory. Tabby steps, mantel height, stair width, the angle of light falling through the front rooms. She called the house quaint the way a realtor says efficient and tapped the rail with a nail the color of a shell. We sat. I ladled soup. Mason praised the aroma and then studied his napkin as if it might coach him through the next play. Sabrina took a careful sip, smiled, and asked about square footage. She wanted to know how many rooms stood underused, what the natural light was like at 10, whether the walls were original plaster or forgiving enough for matte white. I said the house was old enough to be truthful and young enough to need mercy. She laughed without malice and yet without warmth. Kindness is not consent. I kept the pace of a quiet host, passed the bread, and told the story of the china, how Ruth once bartered 2 pies for the last pair of plates. Sabrina nodded, looked past me to the mantel, and labeled my antiques as character pieces. She said authenticity sells. She said the rooms would pop if we let them breathe. "Your face has that rugged thing," she added, quick as a spark. "No Halloween mask necessary." Mason gave a small laugh, the one men use when they hope 2 storms cancel. I set my spoon down and picked it up again. The gas lamp pressed my reflection into the window. The scar over my left brow gathered a shadow like a folded wing. I did not tell the story that made it. Some chapters belong to the people who were soaked in them with you. She praised the light in the front rooms and mused about a coastal series. Soft linen, pale paint, clean lines. She called my spare bedrooms opportunity. Mason asked if the soup had tarragon. I said a little. The bowl warmed my hands and cooled something sharper. I let her words pass through like wind through screens, leaving flecks I could sweep later. She used verbs I recognized from pitches: optimize, declutter, monetize. Families use other words: keep, hold, remember. When I cleared plates, she drifted to the sideboard, touched a framed photograph, and stepped back to catch the angle as if light were currency. I boxed leftovers, labeled them with a date the way I would a file, and carried them to the door. The street smelled of brine and brick. I told them goodnight with the civility I carry like a pocket knife: small, useful, never for show. Alone, the house exhaled. I washed 2 bowls, the sink sang a thin, metallic song the plumber calls normal. I dried the china with a towel Ruth hemmed and listened to the hallway settle. The gas lamp drew slow light across the floorboards. The moss outside kept writing its letter over the street. Across the window, I saw the man I have become and the boy my father told to stand up straight until straight felt natural. The scar caught the lamp again. In 2005, the water came fast and thoughtless, and there are parts of that night I keep back the way you keep a promise. I had not thought of it in months. Tonight it arrived uninvited, carried by a joke about masks and a stranger's inventory of my life. I locked the door, I wrote the date and a few lines in the small ledger I keep for moments when nothing is wrong, yet something is not right. Language is evidence. So are silences. I noted her phrases, his laugh and my restraint. Then I put the ledger away and turned off the kitchen light. The piazza kept its glow. The harbor wind softened. And the house, which has held more than I have ever asked a house to hold, settled around me like a witness that intends to stay. The night held me after they left, not with anger, but with the steadying cool a house learns to make for itself. Gas lamps threw soft halos in the window panes. Spanish moss traced its quiet script over the street. I rinsed the last spoon and stood still long enough to hear the pipe settle. On a small card in my ledger, I wrote the date, the line about masks, the way she called memory pieces props, the note that my son laughed to smooth weather that should not be smoothed. I closed the book on those sentences the way a careful man closes a gate at dusk. Morning arrived with a pale tide and coffee that had a backbone. I checked the harbor report, stretched my bad shoulder, and reviewed my notes for the library class I teach twice a week: credit freezes, spotting spoofed links, the script for saying no without apology. I am not a man of speeches. I am a man of systems. Systems keep the blood cool when charm tries to pass as permission. The phone rang near 8. Mason's voice came bright and thin, like a smile that had been ironed flat. She was joking. "Maybe you should apologize," he said. He moved quickly to logistics and the kind of math that sounds like love when you are tired. A temporary stay after the wedding, just until the market eased, just until something unnamed aligned. I kept my voice level. "Trust isn't the issue," I said. "Terms are." He exhaled into the space between us. "You don't trust me," he said, and I let the sentence sit where he could hear it echo. "I trust you to be my son," I answered. "I trust myself to keep a boundary." I dressed, folded the ledger into my inside pocket, and drove to the Charleston County Register of Deeds. Courthouses keep a different kind of weather. The air is cooler, the light duller, the paper smell old enough to feel reliable. A clerk with neat handwriting walked me through the funding of my revocable trust, then checked the deed language twice to be sure the house now pointed to the trust like a compass. I signed an affidavit of capacity under a fluorescent hum and thanked the notary for the unsung dignity of stamps. On a shaded bench, I called the 3 credit bureaus one by one and froze every door that had my name on it. Each call yielded a confirmation number, a timestamp, a person's name. I spelled back to be certain. I wrote them in the ledger and took a photograph of the page, then emailed myself the photograph with a subject line that would make sense in a hurry. Back home, I changed the Wi-Fi network name and password, the email passwords, the banking credentials, and the administrative code on the smart lock. I turned off the guest profile I had created once for holidays, and I wrote every change on an index card that went into the fireproof box. Paper over panic. It is a principle that has never failed me. At the desk, I made 2 lists in pencil. In the first, I copied the verbs she favored: optimize, declutter, monetize, pop. In the second, I wrote the verbs a family should use: keep, hold, remember, repair. There is theology in grammar if you sit with it long enough. One set of words turns a room into a set, the other keeps a home human. I erased and wrote them again until the difference felt physical. Late afternoon brought the mail, and with it a glossy tube that was not addressed to me but had my address, which is its own kind of trespass. Inside lay a mood board titled Coastal Historic Minimal. The photos were my rooms, washed bluer than they ever are, the angles exaggerated to flatter light that belongs to no season. Sticky notes marched down the margins in tidy handwriting: master, light linens. Mantle, remove portrait. Studio wall, matte white. The edits were so efficient they felt like erasures. Authenticity had been extracted and relabeled content. I slid the prints back into the tube and then into a manila folder labeled with the day and hour. On the folder flap, I listed the week's small intrusions in order. I placed the folder in the top drawer of the desk instead of the safe because I wanted it close, like a pressure gauge you check by habit. Then I opened the ledger and made a final entry: documentation before confrontation. Nothing in me wanted a fight. Everything in me wanted a record. Dusk drew out the salt in the air and laid a calmer pulse under my own. I stepped onto the piazza and watched the gas lamp lift a thin shadow across the scar above my brow. 20 years had not taught that mark new tricks. It simply reminded me that water and people both find the lowest gaps unless you shore them. I thought about the classes at the library and the faces that line up to learn how to be impolite to danger. I thought about the difference between being hospitable and being harvestable. I locked the door at the same deliberate tempo I had used the night before. The house held the day without complaint. In the quiet, I could hear the litany of tiny things that keep a life intact: the click of brass meeting strike plate, the cards stacked in order, the ledger breathing its dry, patient pages. When I turned out the last light, the piazza kept its small circle of gold, and I told myself, not for the first time, that courtesy will carry you far if you let it walk beside a fence. I chose a quiet seafood place on the harbor, the kind that smells faintly of rope tar and lemon, where the servers carry plates like they carry news, calm and on time. Gulls sketched loose commas over the water, and the ice in my sweet tea clicked a slow metronome. I arrived early, asked for a table facing the pier so I could watch the afternoon turn, and repeated the rule I use when tempers threaten to borrow my name. I had come for peace, not capitulation. Civility, yes. Consent, no. Sabrina arrived, curated to the minute. A jacket the color the sky wants to be when tourists take photos, hair shaped like the idea of tide. Mason followed with the hopeful look of a contractor certain a shim can fix any misalignment. I ordered water and kept my elbows off the table the way Ruth taught me. When the menus closed, Sabrina opened with convenience. She painted a small kingdom of ease: auto-pay, paperless billing, a dashboard that would optimize the monthlies and keep me from wasting time with checks. Care lived at the center of her pitch, but the key to the castle fit every door. She praised Mason as a builder who could fix what sags, and her smile included my house in the list of repairs. I used phrases I trust because phrases, like tools, have to be proved by use. Ink you can hold. Paper over panic. Terms, not tempers. I laid them on the table like flatware and kept my voice quiet so truth would not feel like a door slamming. She smiled like a professional, pleasant and impossible to grip, and shifted her appraisal toward content value. The light in my front rooms, the angle of the stare, the way pale paint would make the space read larger on camera. Mason nodded with the rhythm of a man trying to satisfy two masters by tilting the plate. The hush of the dining room carried our performance. We were three people pretending to have lunch while we negotiated a deed. I watched myself the way I watch a pressure gauge, tested each breath for steadiness, ate slowly and stored every new euphemism where it belonged, in the box labeled price tags for people. When the check arrived, Sabrina reached first, then stopped, suddenly aware that a public gesture of generosity could undercut the argument she had just made about managing my life. I left cash for the tip because paper is a language even busy rooms respect. We parted with smiles that felt like receipts. Back home, the day showed me its other face. The first voicemail was chirpy, the tone that assumes gratitude. A bank I do not use congratulated me on a pre-approval for a home equity line secured by my property. They invited me to call with any questions and left a case number as if we were partners in an errand. The second message came from the neighborhood association, a bright note about processing a resident affidavit adding Sabrina Hale at my address for parking and school zone convenience. The filing date matched her last visit the way footprints match the fresh part of a path. My hands stayed steady because I have practiced steadiness longer than I have practiced anything. I called the bank first and declined the product. I flagged the inquiry as unauthorized, asked for the audit trail, and requested removal from any marketing queue. I repeated the representative's name and identification number until the syllables settled in my notes. I wrote the time, the case number, and the promised follow-up letter. When the call ended, I returned the association's message and filed a formal objection. I asked who submitted the affidavit, by what method, under which policy, and for a copy of whatever document had persuaded the system that my house had grown a second resident without my hand. I wrote down the citations the coordinator read because policy language is a kind of weather you need to measure before you decide how to dress. The ledger lay open on the desk the way a field log lies open beside a patient. I documented each step the way a heartbeat makes itself known. I printed the call logs and clipped them behind the day's page. I wrote a brief memo to file in plain language. Soft caretaker framing followed by immediate attempts at access. Patterns suggest asset capture rather than family formation. I emailed a scan to myself because redundant trails keep the rain from finding the same leak twice. During the HOA call, a name surfaced, the missing gear behind the convenience machine. Derek Lyons, a consultant, helping families with transitions. The coordinator said the phrase with the ease of a brochure and gave me an email and firm name when I asked. I wrote both in block letters large enough to be legible in a storm, then let the pen hover. I did not call him. Documentation before confrontation. It has saved more friendships than any apology I have ever drafted. The manila folder grew from slender to purposeful. I slid the bank's voicemail transcript inside, the HOA note, the lunch receipt with its small annotations, verbs circled, sentiments underlined, along with Derek's particulars. I kept the folder in the top right drawer, not the safe. Active files live where your hand can find them without thought. I wrote a new label on its tab, House Boundary Q2. Through the window, the harbor reflected a patient kind of light. The rhythm of clerical work did its good work on me. People misunderstand precautions. They think fear and defense are the same thing. Precautions are simply good manners extended to your future self. The pencil tapping the margin, the paper smoothing under your palm, the dates lined like fence pickets. These are a creed you can practice without raising your voice. On the piazza, the breeze worked the moss like a long sentence. I set the folder down with a deliberate palm, the way you set down a weight you intend to pick up again. In the glass, my brow collected the lamp's small shadow, the mark that is never asked to be explained. I thought about the distance between pitch and procedure, how small it seems until someone crosses it. That line had been crossed and then annotated, and now it lived in ink. My private rules do not change because someone else prefers shortcuts. Hospitality is not access. Logistics are not love. Convenience is not consent. If I needed a creed for an evening, I had one. The storm had sent its first scout with a cheerful voice and a template for forms. I would answer with paper, stamps, and the quiet weather of a man who refuses to be hurried. I wrote one last line before I put the ledger away. First, fracture noted, verify, do not warn, then locked the door and felt the mechanism return to itself. The house, which asks so little and gives so much, settled an inch lower on its foundation like a good horse under a firm rider, and I let the steadiness move through me while the harbor darkened to a useful shade of blue. I started the morning with the kind of work that steadies a man, sentences. I drafted an email to Mason as if I were briefing a hospital board, plain as glass and free of heat. I laid out the facts: insurance exposure if non-owners occupy, code and occupancy issues in historic houses, liability in case of injury, the conflict between renovations and preservation, the simple human cost of a boundary ignored. I added the interpersonal clause I have learned to trust. Shared space is where love goes to be measured by chores. I ended with terms, not tempers. The house will not be a stopgap. Financial help, if any, will be contractual and separate from the property. His reply arrived before the kettle boiled. You're making this a test. 5 words, tight as a fist. I made no counter-argument. I archived the message, printed both emails, and stapled them across the day's ledger page like labels on a specimen. Sometimes silence is not surrender, it is ballast. I walked the city market to let my head cool. The brick kept the night's heat like a low grudge, and the salt in the air softened nothing. Baskets of sweetgrass shone like quiet work, coils upon coils made by hands that know how repetition becomes grace. I greeted vendors by name, tasted a toothpick of praline I did not intend to buy, and let my pace find a harbor rhythm. Near the middle sheds, I ran into Ruth and Daniel Hale. We traded remarks about tourists and tides and which week the azaleas pretend not to be show-offs. They are good people, courteous in a way that does not make you feel graded. We wished each other a decent day, and that could have been the end of it. It wasn't. Mason called while I paused in the shade, and he put the phone on speaker without thinking. Sabrina's voice carried that polished ease I am coming to recognize, the lilt that makes complicated things sound like errands. Derek can walk Dad through options, she said, as if options were bridges that arrive when called. I noted the phrase in my head the way a surveyor notes a boundary marker. Walk Dad through options, a gentle sentence with a hinge at its middle. Dusk found me at the drawer. I slid the courier's envelope into the folder, turned the brass key, and heard the small certainty of metal deciding to hold. Outside, Spanish moss moved like a long sentence that will finish when it is ready, not before. I told myself one last time what I already knew. The refusal has been issued softly. The fact it wasn't taken is now in ink. The next contact will be on my terms and in writing. Then I locked the door, the house sighed that inch of relief it always gives me, and the harbor darkened to the useful color of resolve. Late heat pressed on the piazza like a palm. I set the manila folder on the dining table and let the house breathe around it, the way a patient steadies before the needle. Tea cooled beside the ledger. I rehearsed calm, the kind that does not need volume because it keeps receipts. Outside, the harbor light turned the floorboards honey, and the moss in the oaks wrote its long sentence over the block. Inside, the folder waited, unromantic as a lock. Mason arrived already braced, jaw set, shoulders tight from carrying a story he preferred to the one on paper. He paced once, then twice, and accused me of sabotage, of turning life into an exam I wanted him to fail. I stayed seated. I touched the folder with my fingertips and opened it as if it were any other meeting on any other day, which, in effect, it was. I put the bank voicemail transcript down first, case number visible, then the email chain from the association about a resident affidavit with a name that is not mine. The mood board prints went next, sticky notes mapping my rooms into content blocks. Then the contractor estimate and the content calendar labeled for a July that had not yet earned entrance. I offered no blame. I read dates, times, names, documentation before confrontation, the creed that has spared me theatrics and saved me rooms. He tried to steer past the papers. Scripts are easier than facts. The doorbell cut his next sentence in half. I opened to find Ruth and Daniel Hale holding a pound cake and manners you could rest on. They said they had come to smooth things, to ensure everyone was heard in full sentences, not fragments. I stepped aside. The afternoon polished the wood under their feet and reached for the portrait on the mantel the way light does when it recognizes what it falls on. We exchanged the small courtesies that give larger moments room to move. Daniel thanked me for receiving them, and then, as he straightened, his gaze caught above my left brow. The air shifted. He blinked once, twice, as if a page in him had stuck and now released. Ruth's hand went to her mouth before her voice found shape. She named the year, 2005, and a newspaper photograph captioned "Man on a Rope." She said culvert and surge and siren like beads on a string she had kept close for decades. She said a girl's wrist in a stranger's hand and the kind of prayer you do not publish. Sabrina had drifted from the hallway to the room's edge without my noticing. Recognition undid the careful scaffolding of her face. The 13-year-old who had tasted brown water rose through the influencer's gloss, and the sound she made did not belong to a camera. She covered her mouth. Her shoulders folded the way a body does when a memory takes back the room. The vein of performance, so reliable until it isn't, went slack. For one unguarded beat, the house held her as a person, not a brand. I declined the pedestal offered. I do not accept it because it eats the air. I don't tell that story, I said, more to the wood than to the people. It belongs to the water and to who we were in it. Modesty is not a performance when you understand that some things become smaller when spoken too often. The scar above my brow collected the window's thin shadow and went on being what it is, a punctuation mark on a sentence the river wrote. I slid the contractor packet beside the pound cake and let the contrast sit, the intention to design over versus the intention to break bread. The table did the arithmetic that language sometimes refuses. I restated the facts in their order, a home equity line pre-approved without me, a resident affidavit filed for a person whose mail is not on my mantle, measurements taken in rooms that hold the dead gently, a content calendar scheduled for a future I had not been asked to inhabit. I did not narrate sin, I offered sequence. Mason looked from the papers to his fiancée and back, and I watched the struggle in him when stories collide, the one where his father is obstinate and the one where his father keeps clean books. His hands gave away what his jaw refused. A tremor at the tendons, a small surrender that is not defeat so much as the beginning of seeing. He sat because standing had started to cost too much. Ruth spoke first, a steady chord where the room had gone percussive. She said a home is not a ladder even when life is steep. She said gratitude does not obligate access, that love can hold limits without apology. Daniel nodded and admitted that silence can be its own poor counsel. They were not grading anyone. They were staking the ground where consent grows. Sabrina reached for words and found a broken stem. I didn't mean, she started, and then the sentence realized it could not carry what needed carrying. Her eyes landed on the mood board's sticky note, remove, pointing at Ruth's portrait. She flinched at her own handwriting. Sometimes the most honest confession is a wince. I put the folder away and spoke in the same tone I use when truth needs the dignity of low volume. No one will move into this house. Not for a night, not for a season. The deed is aligned to a trust that will fund a low-country nursing scholarship in Ruth's name when the house no longer needs me and I no longer need it. Any help to Mason will be contractual and independent of this property. And because transparency is part of care, I said the part about the media distributor, a quiet minority stake, ethics clauses, a pause if elder exploitation ever appears in a production schedule. Housekeeping, not revenge, boundaries, not theater. The room's temperature shifted from accusation to breath. The pound cake remained uncut because we had not yet earned sweetness. Paper lay where cake should be, and sometimes that is the right order. Outside, a gull crossed the window like a brief signature. Inside, no one reached for a camera. We stood in the unphotogenic work of being truer than we had been an hour ago. When silence settled into something usable, I moved to the piazza window. The scar took the lamp's narrow line again. In the glass, I saw my son's profile, less boy, more man, and beside him the shaken face of a woman who had been a child in water and may yet learn to be more than the stories she sells. Behind them, Ruth and Daniel stood in the posture of people who know what tides can do and remain anyway. The past had spoken without flourish. The future would be written in the grammar of choices. I breathed, the house breathed, and the harbor deepened to the color that lets boats come home without apology. The room settled into a working quiet. Paper remained where cake should have been, and the house held the temperature of decision. Not victory, not defeat. Decision. Mason's shoulders had dropped an inch, the way steel relaxes when you take the load off. Sabrina's veneer was gone, leaving a face that belonged to a person and a past she didn't curate. Ruth and Daniel stood where adults stand when the water remembers. Steady, useful, not performing. I have learned to give people choices in plain language and to put those choices on paper before anyone confuses hope with terms. I laid a single sheet on the table, a page I had drafted long ago out of habit, blank lines waiting for signatures that would matter. 2 paths, I said without raising my voice. Escalate or repair. Escalation meant formal complaints, bank fraud unit, HOA, and if needed, the contractor board. It meant a cease and desist drawn by counsel, and a courtesy notice to the media distributor that would force their ethics clauses to wake up. Repair meant withdrawing every unauthorized action today, accepting written terms that protected the house and the dignity in it, and beginning accountability steps that could be verified. Housekeeping, not leniency. Paper, then promises. I slid the terms and timeline forward. The language was simple, no theatrics, no cohabitation ever at my address. Lease your own place. No access to my accounts. Wi-Fi, smart lock, mail, or records. Revoke and delete any retained credentials. Immediate withdrawals, the HELOC pre-approval rescinded in writing, the HOA resident affidavit withdrawn, the contractor estimate canceled, the content calendar scrapped. Written acknowledgments, apology letters to me and to the association itemizing each action taken without consent, accountability, weekly trauma therapy, and a financial literacy course, proof due at 30 days. Digital boundaries, no filming or photographing in my home, no references to it on any channel. Financial help for Mason, if any, would be contractual and independent of the property. Check-ins. 48 hours for proof of withdrawals. 30 days for therapy and class receipts, 90 days for a progress note. Mason read the page twice, jaw loosening as he worked through what adulthood costs when shortcuts are no longer on the menu. When he looked up, the boy who tried to placate storms had given way to a man choosing a road. Today, he said, tapping the section about withdrawals. Then softer, a single word that mattered more than speeches. Lease. I wrote both words in my head the way a field doctor records pulse. Quietly, with relief he won't show. Sabrina's hands trembled on the table's edge. Armor or accountability. There is no middle when a house is on the line. She stared at the clause about unauthorized actions and nodded once, as if agreeing with a clock. "I'll withdraw everything," she whispered. She admitted she had looped in Derek Lyons, a consultant who could walk Dad through options. She gave me his email and firm name without prompting. "Do the apologies have to be specific?" she asked, searching for mercy and vagueness. "Specific, or they aren't apologies," I answered. Ruth moved like a tide you can trust. She placed a pen beside the sheet and smoothed the paper with the flat of her hand. Daniel said, "We'll drive." And there was no performance in it, only logistics properly used. Their presence did not tilt the room, it braced it. They understood what the night in 2005 had taught them, that love can be grateful without becoming access. I kept my posture the way I keep my books, exact without spectacle. We initialed the margins and signed the bottom line. I scanned the page to my email from my phone while the ink was still damp and sent a copy to Mason's address. The ledger opened to accept names, time, the shape of what had been decided. I stapled a printout to the day's entry and closed the folder without satisfaction. Evidence is not a drum, it is a compass. Before anyone stood, I restated the long facts. The deed aligned to a trust that in time would fund a low-country nursing scholarship in Ruth's name, an affidavit of capacity already on file. Then the conditional fact, I would notify the media distributor only if conduct suggested elder exploitation again. Contingency, not threat. There is a difference, and I keep it holy. We divided next steps like adults click through tasks that matter. Sabrina and her parents would go to the bank, then the association office, then the contractor's showroom if necessary. Mason would tour an apartment and send me a photograph of a signed lease, not a plan to get one. I would send confirming emails, one to the bank memorializing the withdrawal request, one to the association summarizing our call and asking for written confirmation of the affidavit's removal. Paper over polite intentions. I have never seen it fail. When the door closed behind them, the house exhaled again. I stepped onto the piazza and let the harbor air rinse the residue of a scene I had not wanted but had refused to fear. The pull to go nuclear, lawyers, brands, bright lights, lost its voltage. The better creed held, verify, don't warn, paper, not performance. On the desk inside, I drafted a short disclosure letter to the media distributor for my own conscience, noting a potential conflict posture and my insistence on ethics clauses if boundary violations reappeared. I did not ask them to act. Transparency, like salt, works best in measured pinches. Dusk tilted the street toward the color boats prefer when they come home without apology. I placed the signed terms behind the day's ledger entry and turned the key in the drawer. The scar above my brow caught the gas lamp's thin line and filed it away like a proof that never tires of being proven. 2 doors stood in me, one latched for escalation, one open for repair. I had chosen and written both. The house kept its line. The night steadied around it. And for the first time in a long week, I believed the next chapter could be built without tearing out any load-bearing walls. The morning after the signing felt like a house returning to its own pulse. The page with our initials lay flat in the drawer, the brass key back in its dish. I brewed strong tea, wiped the counter with the patience of someone who believes in small order, and opened the ledger. No victory notes, no vindication. I wrote, "Accountability in motion," and closed the book for the time being. The day needed ordinary chores more than declarations. At the Meeting Street Library, I taught URL triage to a half-circle of seniors. We practiced hovering over links, spotting misspellings that dress like cousins, and saying no thank you without stuffing the apology in after it. We rehearsed the steps for freezing credit, bureau by bureau, confirmation number by confirmation number. They laughed, polite and relieved, when I said my favorite line, "Paper over panic." It isn't poetry, it steadies hands. By noon, the first ripple reached me sideways. A neighbor mentioned, in the careful tone people use around live wires, that an audio clip from my doorbell had surfaced in a neighborhood email chain and then slipped into wider waters. The quip about quaint and my mask rode the current like flotsam with a label. I neither hunted it down nor shared it. I wrote one neutral line in the ledger, public discourse outside my control. Whoever forwarded the HOA emails or the clip had their own reasons. I would not add wind to it. Afternoon delivered a louder echo, a small channel that analyzes online manipulation stitched together public breadcrumbs, mood boards, residency filings, cheerful notes from a bank that wasn't mine, and set them to calm narration. I watched for 30 seconds and turned it off. I do not feed storms. Brands, however, have their own barometers. An agency wrote to ask for comment. I replied with one sentence: I don't participate in public commentary. Then I sent quiet follow-ups to the bank and the association, requesting written confirmations. Mason came by near dusk with the look of a man who spent a day defending a dam with his hands. He stood on the piazza and apologized for siding with convenience and for trying to broker peace by handing away my walls. I told him I accepted the apology, that he did not owe me a performance of remorse, and that adulthood is simpler and harder than any speech. Find a place you can afford without my name on it. Stay at a hotel a few nights, I added, so your head can read itself. He nodded, grateful in a way that finally looked like rest. The next morning brought a letter written in careful script on plain paper. Sabrina's handwriting belonged to someone concentrating. 3 pages named what needed naming: the residency affidavit, the HELOC inquiry through Derek, the measurements taken without permission, the remarks at my door, the intention to turn rooms into content. She wrote that she had booked weekly trauma therapy and enrolled in a basic finance class at the community college. The tone was unadorned. The specificity did its own work better than any flourish. I stamped the envelope with the receipt date and filed the letter behind the day's entry. By midday, 2 brands reached out again. I sent the same single line. 2 neighbors asked what really happened. I said, I don't discuss my family. I have learned that the fewer words you give a rumor, the quicker it loses oxygen. My calm was not for sale. After class that week, 3 seniors lingered to say the online story. However it reached them, nudged them to check their credit reports and lock their files. One of them brought a notebook of passwords reorganized by hand. Another had written her children with a new rule: no more helpful logins. I logged those moments as secondary good, not of my making. Late Friday, a text chimed. A photograph of a signed lease for a 1-bedroom off Cannon Street. Mason's signature sat firm in the white margin, and below it not a single letter of my name. I printed the image and filed it under Mason Housing, annotated with independent of property, and let myself feel the quiet relief that follows an adult's decision. Evenings kept their duties. I wiped the brass latch and watched the gas lamp pour a small gold circle onto the piazza. The harbor wind combed the moss and set the block to whisper. Inside, I read again the bank's confirmation, withdrawal processed, and the association's note removing the affidavit. I exported both to PDFs and slipped the printouts behind the day's entry. Paper held. The internet roared, but paper held. I declined interviews and gossip, kept my phone on silent, and stayed with paper. Stillness is not weakness. It is weathered discipline earned by long years. Before bed, I stood at the window and listened to the neighborhood's soft machinery. Steps, laughter, a bicycle freewheeling past the corner, tires rolling over a seam of old cobblestone. I wrote the last line of the day: confirmations received, letter filed, lease printed, storm moving offshore. Then I turned off the light. The house stayed itself, which is more than can be said for most things that live online. 30 days to the date, I set the ledger flat and clipped the terms and timeline above the day's page like a heading. The folder held what I'd asked to see: a bank letter confirming the HELOC withdrawal, the HOA's removal of the affidavit, a tidy email from the contractor canceling his estimate and wishing everyone a lovely summer. Sabrina's handwritten apology from last week sat where it belonged, stamped with the date of receipt. The list now required proof of effort rather than promises. I sharpened a pencil and wrote the word verification at the top margin. It is a better word than forgiveness when the job is to separate weather from climate. Sabrina texted at mid-morning to ask for a check-in. I replied with 3 words that have saved more peace than speeches. Front porch only. No camera crew, no casual entry, no tour. Just coffee in the breeze where boundaries are furniture you can see. I set 2 mugs on the iron table, left the door closed behind me, and let the house keep its own breath while we used ours. She came dressed for ordinary life, no ring light in her eyes, no scripted brightness. In her hands, a simple folder, the cheap kind you buy when appearances don't need help. We sat. The harbor wind moved the moss like handwriting. She opened the folder and began with papers that knew what they were. Therapy attendance receipts for 4 weeks, each signed by a clinician whose name did not need to be famous. An enrollment slip from Trident Tech for a basic literacy course, and a note from the instructor marking completion of the first unit. Copies of withdrawal emails sent from her address so I could see she had owned the unwinding. 2 apology letters, one to me, one to the association, numbered lists naming the exact trespasses and the actions taken to reverse them. I dated each page in my hand, clipped them to the ledger, and placed duplicates in the folder. This is what repair looks like when you refuse to feed it adjectives. "Thank you for bringing proof," I said, and the words were simple on purpose. She nodded, palms flat, no reach for theater. We kept to plain talk. I restated the digital lines. No filming in or around my home, no interior photos, no stories referencing this house. Contact by email unless a porch time is scheduled. Any help I might give Mason remains contractual and separate from the property. She repeated the rules back, not like a student trying to earn a grade, but like a driver reading road signs aloud to stay alert. "Understood," she said. "No filming. Email only, house off limits." A text chimed midway through the coffee. Mason's first rent paid, utilities in his name, an image of the receipt filed beside a lease I had already printed. I placed the new page under Mason Housing, wrote independent of property in the margin, and felt that small inner click good systems make when they hold. I did not congratulate him by text. We are writing a new grammar and it doesn't waste words. Back at the table, I pulled the terms and timeline and drew a slow line through the box labeled immediate withdrawals. Done. The next boxes required time rather than speed. Weekly therapy, coursework, digital boundaries. I set a reminder for 90 days and another for a year. Milestones are kinder than open-ended hope. They let both parties keep their footing. I had drafted an addendum the night before, a page separate from the trust because the trust is granite and this was wood. The offer was simple. If the year passed with sustained compliance, no access requests, no filming, no erosion of the line, Sabrina could volunteer a few hours a month with the Low Country Nursing Scholarship that will one day carry Ruth's name. Administrative help only, no fund control, service, not access. I slid the page across the table and explained that it was a road, not a reward, the kind of work that teaches you how not to center yourself. Service, not access, she said, and I watched the phrase find a chair in her. She didn't sign, that wasn't the point. We shook on the idea the old way and let the house witness. In the afternoon, I wrote a letter that said, less than I could have and more than I used to. Gratitude for compliance to date. Restatement of no cohabitation and no access. A reminder that apologies are behaviors that repeat. I copied Mason and by design Ruth and Daniel. Transparency works like salt, strong in excess, strengthening in measure. I printed the letter for the folder and sent the email to travel at the speed of electricity. Library attendance ticked up that week. 2 newcomers arrived with printed fraud alerts they had placed on their files after a friend of a friend mentioned a story. I taught the class the polite script for boundary keeping with family, and a woman in a floral blouse practiced it until the apology fell off the end of her sentence and landed where it could no longer hurt her. Secondary good, I wrote in the ledger, not of my making. Evening laid its soft hand on the piazza. The gas lamp hadn't yet claimed the dark. The breeze was easy and the brass latch warm under my cloth. I sealed the day's packet and returned it to the drawer, then paired the key with its dish. Through the glass, the scar above my brow caught a thin line of light and did what it always does. Remembered without explaining. I wrote one last line. Repair path under verification. Next review at 90 days. Then I closed the ledger, let the porch keep the quiet, and went inside where the house, unchanged, stayed changed enough for the future to visit without getting ideas. 90 days can drain the theatrics out of a life if you let paper do the talking. My ledger showed a neat run of check marks. No filming, no references to the house, therapy kept weekly, a finance class begun and continued, Mason paying rent on time with utilities in his name. I didn't mistake a quarter for a year, but the horizon had changed color. When Mason asked about dinner at a quiet place off King Street, brick walls, dim lamps, the sound of plates instead of phones, I said yes with 3 terms that have served me longer than most friendships. Arrive on time, no cameras, leave on time. I walked over while the light still held the facades like warm coins. The host sat me at a 2-top against the brick where I could see the room breathe. Restaurants have their own weather. This one promised small human storms and fast clearings. Mason arrived first, looking more rested than I've seen him since Ruth's last good autumn. Without fanfare, he placed his keys on the table, a habit of his, and I noticed the fob carried a different weight. The weight of 1 life, not 2. Sabrina came a few minutes later, plain blouse, low shoes, hair pulled back like a sentence that doesn't need adjectives. She carried a thin folder, the kind you buy in a drugstore, which is a better sign than a purse that announces itself. We exchanged simple greetings. "Good evening," I said. "Evening," she answered. Mason smiled in a way that didn't ask permission from either of us to exist. We ordered drinks, water for all 3, and food without ceremony. Grilled fish, a salad, a side of okra because some traditions insist. Conversation started where ordinary lives start when no one is performing. Mason talked about a bridge near the marsh, how steel sulks in heat and behaves in cold, how a project settles when men stop trying to be famous and just measure right. Sabrina mentioned trimming the volume of her channel. Lighter cadence, steadier subjects, fewer pivots to family when that word still needs repairs. We traded small talk about rent increases, the city's new bike lanes, a bakery that overdoes its cinnamon and sells anyway. When the server set plates down and left us to our own weather, Sabrina slid the folder to me. Inside were copies of the proof I'd asked for, updated therapy attendance, a line from the clinician confirming frequency and focus, a certificate for the first module of financial literacy with an enrollment note for the second, an email thread confirming Mason's tenancy and utilities, a short log of small choices I hadn't requested but didn't mind seeing. Dates when she declined brand concepts that required family house footage, notes on ethics meetings she'd had with her agent. I read in silence, date-stamped the copies, and returned the originals. Received, I said, because verification is a better benediction than praise. The room did its work around us, cutlery, low talk, a man at the corner table telling a story with his hands, and not a single phone held up to trap it. After we ate, I restated the central line once, like a speed limit you should know by now. No cohabitation, no access, no filming. Sabrina nodded, no defensiveness to fix. Understood, she said. Mason added that life in his own place had simplified everything. I can hear myself think, he said, and looked surprised by the fact. There is a difference between a reward and a road, and I try to keep that grammar clean. I mentioned the pathway we'd sketched, volunteer work with the Lowcountry Nursing Scholarship after a sustained year of compliance. Administrative help, I said, no fund control, service, not currency. She asked, without eagerness, what clerical needs show up in small programs. Lists, I said, thank you notes, files that don't fight the person who opens them. We let the thought sit without signing it into the wrong shape. When the plates were cleared, Mason handed me a small envelope addressed in Daniel's careful hand. I opened it later, but even then I could tell what it would be: a card from Ruth and Daniel, gratitude for the chance to repair, and a modest check for the scholarship seed fund earmarked for administrative costs only. They understand the dignity of earmarks. It keeps everyone honest. We walked out into air that had decided to be kind. At the curb, we exchanged a simple farewell. "Good night," I said. "Good night," Mason answered. Sabrina added, "Thank you for dinner," and it sounded like the kind of thank you that isn't paying a debt. It's acknowledging a meal. A meal. Back home. I opened the safe and reread the trust documents, not because I doubted them, but because granite is a comfort when the day has gone mostly human. I filed the evening's proofs and the hail card under their headings, placed the check in a holding sleeve marked pending legal structures, and closed the safe with the small satisfaction of work done properly. In the ledger I wrote, "Ordinary dinner, no cameras. Boundaries held. Service later, maybe. Peace. Conditional. Real." On the piazza, the gas lamp stitched a thin gold seam across the scar over my brow. The street offered the small sounds that make a life feel accurately scaled. A bicycle coasting, two teenagers laughing, a door closing somewhere with no drama beyond its hinge doing as designed. I locked the latch, the brass choosing closure with the click I rely on, and let the house breathe around me. Sleep came like a decent friend, without speech, without applause, just a hand on the shoulder reminding me that nothing in this day needed to be posted to have happened. Dawn laid a pale seam along the piazza rail, and the harbor sent up that clean salt that reminds you the day has agreed to try again. I polished the brass latch, the way I always do when a season in my life closes. Slow circles, no hurry, a cloth that remembers my hand. The latch never learns the names of our storms, only whether we kept it oiled. Boundaries are like that. They are quiet architecture. You repaint the fence, you don't hold a press conference about the paint. She didn't know who I was, but the part that mattered was never the rope or the photograph. In the 2005 storm, I tied off to a culvert and leaned into a current. I have not told the story because it is not a trophy. The truth inside that night was simple. Under pressure, I make steady decisions in the order they must be made. Years later, when the pressure came dressed in manners and marketing, the method didn't change. Ledger open, paper over panic, verify before you raise your voice. Courtesy in the tone, iron in the terms. That is the spine I kept. Other things she didn't know mattered more than any headline could have. She didn't know I keep a ledger and that writing a date beside a fact calms the blood better than thunder. She didn't know I love hospitality but refuse harvest, that I can pass a plate and still say no to a key request said with a smile. She didn't know a widower can be gentle without being captured. She didn't know a house can be both shelter and sentence. Here is where you may enter. Here is where you will not. Revenge would have been the easiest performance to book. It would have sold, too, in a city that likes its stories salted and its heroes under gaslight. The longer I live, the more I trust consequences to deliver themselves without my help. Banks reverse what they should not have started. Associations pull filings that arrived without consent. Brands pause when their internal weather vane spins toward caution. None of that required me to aim a spotlight. I signed, I scanned, I slept. Mason swung by after work one evening and leaned against the piazza post like he hadn't in years. He talked about the bridge, the way steel behaves if you stop arguing with physics and accept its temperament. He mentioned a leaky faucet and a neighbor who waters her tomatoes at dusk and says hello even when no one's looking. We spoke briefly, warm and unsentimental in the dialect fathers and sons earn when they let each other stand. Love lands better when it doesn't lean. Sabrina's emails, when they come, are short and free of performative shine. She logs small decisions most people would never notice. A sponsorship declined because it demanded family house footage. A therapy session kept when travel could have offered an excuse. An afternoon volunteering at a clinic, unfilmed, alphabetizing charts while someone else ran the show. I reply with 2 words that are older than applause and worth more. Received. Continue repentance is repetition. It is not one big act, it is a sequence that does not tire. I reviewed the trust papers again and drafted a single-page operating checklist for the scholarship that will one day carry Ruth's name. No lyricism, just cadence and chores. Quarterly reconciliations, a reporting email that fits on one screen, a conflict of interest rule that leaves no wiggle where influence might try to get charming. I slid the checklist behind the trust like a map tucked into a glove box. Service, not access. I could hear Ruth's laugh at my insistence on tidy columns, and the laugh did not hurt. At the library, our circle widened. More seniors arrived with their credit frozen and their passwords finally on paper in a kitchen drawer. A few brought their sons or daughters, people who still say things like, "Let me just log in for you," and practiced how to be useful without walking through someone else's door. We had a good morning, the kind where nobody triumphs and everybody learns the polite sentence that ends with a period instead of an apology. In the ledger I wrote, secondary good, sustained, and closed the cover the way you close a hymn book after a familiar song. I kept 3 lines where I could see them until they wore grooves in me. Hospitality isn't access. Logistics aren't love. Convenience isn't consent. I repeated them on the piazza under my breath, the way you repeat a walking prayer. They sound simple until the person asking wears someone you love on their arm. Simplicity, I've learned, is what survives persuasion. She wanted to humiliate me. She didn't know who I really was. I am the man who keeps ink wet and fences bright, who can welcome you to the table and still keep the deed in a drawer with a lock that remembers my hand. I am the man whose quiet systems outlast storms. That is enough. It always was. Endings rarely arrive with trumpets. More often, they slip in like evening light across a familiar floor, revealing what was always there. Steady hands, a lock that answers, and a quiet refusal to be moved by noise. The last stretch of this journey is not a victory lap. It is a demonstration that peace is built from unglamorous materials, clear terms, consistent choices, and a disciplined respect for boundaries. When those pieces hold, life stops performing and starts breathing. Some lessons are simple only after they're learned. Hospitality isn't access. Logistics aren't love. Convenience isn't consent. These are not slogans, they are practical tools. They keep a door gracious without making it common, allow generosity to flow without turning into surrender, and remind us that any relationship worth keeping can survive the honesty of a clear number. The work is not to harden, but to clarify, not to annihilate, but to align. There is a particular kind of power in restraint, the power to answer spectacle with structure. Anyone can rage, it takes strength to document. Anyone can threaten, it takes wisdom to verify. In a world that rewards performance, quiet systems can feel invisible, but they are precisely what prevent a bad moment from becoming a bad future. Paper outlives rumor, and a boundary you can point to will always outlast a mood you can't measure. When the storm of opinion rises, dignity hangs its weight on what can be dated, signed, and filed. Repair, when it is possible, is never a speech. It is repetition, not grand gestures, but the small daily choices that refuse to backslide. Showing up for hard conversations, keeping agreements that no one is clapping for, letting time do part of the healing while responsibility does the rest. Real renewal asks for proof, not promises, and for patience that doesn't martyr itself. It declines the sugar rush of public vindication and reaches for the steadier carbohydrate of ordinary good conduct. Independence, too, is a quieter love than we are taught to expect. It doesn't posture or plead. It simply stands, pays its own bills, and admits what belongs to it and what does not. Distance isn't rejection when it is chosen for the sake of respect. Sometimes the kindest thing two lives can do for each other is to occupy separate keys while sharing the same map. Affection travels further when it isn't leaning. Even the internet, with its appetite for spectacle, becomes less frightening when the inner weather is set by something older than the feed. The world may roar, the file still closes. A rumor may sprint, a dated letter still walks into the room with authority. Systems, the good kind, the kind built to protect dignity, are not expressions of fear, but of care. They are hospitality extended to one's future self. They say, you will not have to remember everything, you only have to remember where it's kept. There is a humility in letting consequences, not anger, carry the weight. Withdrawals get processed. Unauthorized filings get reversed. Plans that depended on pressure lose their breath when the line holds. Justice at its best does not humiliate. It clarifies. It does not need a spotlight. It needs a standard and the stillness to keep it. None of this requires heroics. It requires the courage to be ordinary on purpose, to choose a small dinner over a public spectacle, a signed page over a triumphant post, a boundary over a performance. And in that ordinary courage, there is a shifting of gravity. Homes stay homes. Peace becomes conditional, yes, but real. The future, newly uncluttered, begins to look less like a stage and more like a table set for people who mean what they sign. If there is one habit worth keeping, let it be the habit of clean lines. Honor the fence that lets welcome and wisdom coexist. Speak in sentences that end with periods, not apologies. Trace your days with practices that will stand up without your breath holding them together. Let your systems be boring and your life be the place where the beauty happens. Let the table be small and the conversations real. Let the proof arrive on time and the promises take a back seat. Let the work of becoming trustworthy be measured in quiet days that look almost uneventful to anyone who wasn't there. There is a holiness in the unremarkable when it is the result of good structure. The world loves crescendos, but lives are held together by rhythms. Notice, too, how clarity simplifies compassion. When boundaries are explicit, kindness doesn't have to double as self-protection. You can give without calculating the leak. You can listen without negotiating your own safety. You can stand near another person's pain without letting it draft on your resources in a way that leaves both of you diminished. Clarity is not cruelty. It is a form of care that prevents resentment from becoming the secret author of your choices. In the end, the goal isn't to win against anyone. It is to remain intact. To keep your name on your life, to recognize that peace worth having will always be conditional because it relies on habits, not hype. It needs your lock oiled, your documents clear, your calendar marked with the small appointments that keep a life honest. It needs you to keep saying the simple lines until they are muscle memory. Hospitality isn't access. Logistics aren't love. Convenience isn't consent. Carry these lines forward. Use them to decide which invitations deserve your yes and which require a gracious no. Put them on a card if you must. Share them with the people who love you so they can love you in ways that last. Build a small architecture that will outlive moods and weather, hinges that close cleanly, drawers that file truth without fanfare, habits that let you be gentle without being taken. Thank you for spending your time here. If this story stirred something in you, if it sharpened your sense of what to guard, or simply gave language to a boundary you've been trying to name, share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from and which line resonated most. Your reflections help others find their footing. And if you want more stories about resilience, clarity, and the quiet power of doing the right thing the right way, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Until then, may your locks be oiled, your documents clear, and your peace conditional, real.